The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, science advocate Carolyn Weinberg charts a path to avoid climate catastrophe, and it begins with a vote. Education advocate Jeff Bryant tells us why a record number of educators are running for office and what they want. Plus, what will it take to shut down voter suppression? Marc Morial joins the Bill Press Show. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Caroline Weinberg is a community organizer, educator, writer, and advocate for the future of our planet. She says that a new report on climate change makes an unequivocal demand. We need every elected official to commit to action, and it's up to every voter to make sure they do. And we say hello to Caroline Weinberg, Interim Executive Director of March for Science. Caroline, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Always nice to speak with you. You know, if I go to your organization's website, I see this alarming announcement. The Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change found that we have 12 years to prevent the catastrophic effects of climate change. No more vague statements, no more waiting. The time to act is now. First, what new information have we learned from the IPCC?
The IPCC released a report about the impacts of climate change, and what was most striking about it was not the findings necessarily, which is pretty consistent with what we've known. Climate change is bad. The climate is warming. It's going to have grave consequences on the entire planet. What was new about it was a dramatically accelerated timeline. So it's less than 3 degrees now that they expect there to be catastrophic, 3 degrees warming that they expect catastrophic impacts, and that we have basically 12 years to create absolutely massive changes in infrastructure, economy, politics, culture to stave off catastrophic impacts by 2040. So while it confirmed the research findings that we've known for a while, but it amplified the timeline in a very alarming way. And really the dramatic changes that are going to be required to keep us alive in the long term.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I don't think there's any, you can't mince words on this. I mean, it's a dire situation. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah. It's interesting to be in a place where there's no hyperbole. It's actually that bad.
Right. I mean, you can't deny this, and yet they do. And we'll talk about that in a moment. For many Americans, this type of news breeds really a sense of hopelessness. I mean, there's nothing we can do. But your organization exists to say the opposite, that we can take action. So let's break that down a bit. One thing that you have on your website is a letter that people can send to elected officials. What do you want elected officials to hear and do?
Climate change is inevitable, right? We're set on this path. There's no way to kind of reverse the global warming, but that's not a reason to give up. It's a reason to recommit ourselves as a global community to try to keep things from getting even worse. How bad the impacts are going to be is still yet to be decided. And so what we really want is to what taking action does, and it's either on our website or you can text climate to 40649, and it basically puts this report in the hands of every elected official from city council up through Congress, and demands that they acknowledge it and accept the reality on climate change and commit to taking action. I mean, individual changes are really important. We all need to commit ourselves to more sustainable practices, but those changes are not going to have an impact on the world as a whole. We need policy change. We need corporations to change. We need big picture people in power to take action. And the only way to do that is to have constituents and the people who they're accountable to constantly sending them things like this report and just demanding that they make statements and that they take action. Statements are not enough.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and look, with this dire report, 12 years to prevent the catastrophic effects of climate change. I mean, please, people, do something about it.
Yeah, that's pretty much our response.
Yeah, well, let's move ahead to November 6th. One thing voters can do is vote climate deniers out of office. So what do we know about the number of climate deniers that hold elected office, and does this issue actually make them vulnerable?
So I hope it makes them vulnerable. I'm not really sure. So more than 50% of people in Congress and in the House have expressed some kind of climate skepticism, and that includes Democrats and Republicans. We can't let Democrats off the hook for this. Some of them have expressed skepticism around climate. The ones who strongly say that climate change is real and we should do something about it aren't necessarily actually trying to get policies passed that will do something about it. So, talk is cheap at this point. A lot of voters have specific issues that they vote around, whether it's healthcare, gun control, or women's rights, or social justice. I mean, there are issues that people prioritize when they cast their ballot, and it's long past time that climate change be one of those issues. And the only way to change things is for people to, before you go to the ballot box, look at what your officials or candidates have said about climate change in the past. And if they have expressed any doubt or have said this is an issue for future generations to deal with, then, go in the door. Because it's there's a lot of conversation around, this is an issue for the future. It's not going to be our generation. But these impacts are held by 2040. I mean, some of us are going to be alive at that point, hopefully, and children born today are going to be dealing with it. I mean, this isn't something that can keep being put off, and it's something that people need to really be prioritizing when they cast their vote.
Well, and there's the scary thing too, because so the children are going to have to be dealing with it, but they're going to be dealing with something a heck of a lot worse than what we're dealing with now if we don't see this radical change. So, I mean, people really need to get up and get out and vote. Moving from voting out to voting in, what are the policies and ideas voters should be looking for in their candidates at the local, state, and national level when it comes to climate change?
Well, at its most basic, it seems like a surprising thing to have to actually say, but you look for people who accept the scientific consensus on climate change, that it's a reality and that we need to do something about it and that humans have a role in it. That, I would say, is the first step. The policies we need people to take a strong stance and pass policies around reducing emissions, around acknowledging the fact that we need infrastructure changes to protect us from the consequences of climate change, and also to try to, mitigate the issues in the future. That there are significant differences between the impact of climate change on different communities, and that we need to make particular effort to make sure that vulnerable communities are affected. These are all issues that science, bears out. We've known it for a while. It's in the reports that are there. The policies that we need are strong laws on corporations and sustainability in cities. And these are all things that we just need to know that policymakers are committed to. And if they're not, then they have a really good explanation why. There's no valid reason not to be supporting any of those things. It also can be a boon for the economy. I mean, sustainable energy is like where the future is going. So if people aren't making strong policies about climate change, if they're not prioritizing that in their platform, if it's not something they've ever spoken about, then they don't understand how serious it is, and they shouldn't be in office, in my opinion. Whether they're a Democrat or a Republican, if it's not a part of their platform, it means they don't recognize how serious it is, and they need to be, they need to be urged to prioritize it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. One or the other. They either need to go or they need to believe it. We're speaking with Caroline Weinberg, interim executive director of March for Science. Caroline, as we know, American politics is becoming increasingly tribal, meaning I'll vote for my side no matter the issue. When it comes to acting on climate change, it is traditionally a Democrat issue. Where is the room for Republicans to care about climate change?
I think it's been traditionally painted as a Democrat issue, but that's not necessarily accurate. There are a lot of conservatives and Republicans who are deeply worried about climate change. I mean, they accept the science, and they are living on the same planet that we are. They have the same concerns for the future, for their children, for their health, for the general world around us. So I think it's been mischaracterized as a Democratic issue the way that a lot of science has. So I think that acknowledging that is the first step, and not setting it up as this contentious one party or the other issue, and recognizing that we have to be working together. And that we have to kind of find common ground on these things, I think is really what the most important next step that we can do as a culture is not letting it become that red versus blue issue.
Mm-hmm. Keep away from the myopic view of one party or the other, and make sure
Exactly.
that it's the global view,
Exactly.
and this is about saving the world. I mean,
exactly. It's a lot easier to be like, Republicans hate climate change, let's vote them all out, but that mentality is easier because it's easy to have a villain, but it's not actually accurate to the way that the world works. Republicans
Mm-hmm.
are not all anti-climate change. Democrats don't all believe in climate change. We have to move past that.
No, and I think it's a good point to bring up. Now let's get back to the theme of hope. This is an issue felt particularly hard by young people who wonder now if they should even have children of their own. What do you want to say to them?
They can't vote yet. A lot of young people, some of them can, obviously, but that they need to prioritize voting. There was recently a study that came out that said that something like less than 25% of people aged 18 to 29 are planning on voting in the next election, which is just disturbing on a level that I have trouble processing. But to make it your civic responsibility to vote, to get out to your representative, to get out and talk to your officials. If you can't vote, then urge your parent to actually vote for your future. Like, show them the timeline of the fact that you want to be able to breathe clean air when you're in your 40s, and that's, I think, like the best that we can do is making sure that young people have a strong voice and that they're listened to. And the only way to do that, I mean, history has told us, like, the only way to do that is to basically be yelling at the top of your lungs. And I think that's unfortunately the world that we're handing young people, is that they need to just be constantly getting in official spaces and constantly advocating for their future. Otherwise, it's in jeopardy. As for whether or not they should have kids, I mean, the world is very overpopulated, but hopefully we can change things, that they can do whatever they want with their reproductive health.
Maybe we're marching into a different area with that question, but I think the more important part is
That's
absolutely
another subset.
Right, exactly. Before we let you go, and talking to all of our listeners, young and old alike, how can they learn more about March for Science, and talk about some of your upcoming actions of your calendar?
Sure. So you can head to marchforscience.com for more information just on the general organization. Every week we highlight a different action. Right now, as I said, it's sending this report to officials at every level of government and urging them to take action. We're working on mobilizing people around the election, get out the vote, not just registering people, but it's all well and good if you're registered, but if you don't actually show up on November 6th, you're not actually going to change anything. So look at your work schedule today, or your school schedule, find out if you're going to be able to get off. Legally, you have to, your kind of boss has to give you time to vote, but we all know that the reality is sometimes that doesn't work out. So get an absentee ballot. If you can't make it, make a plan and actually show up. Whether or not you think the race is decided, to vote. That's November 6th. Right after the election, we're going to really focus on getting people to reach out to both existing officials and the newly elected ones to make sure that they're prioritizing science in their policy in the upcoming year. And we're also starting a podcast. That's a side note. So more on that. We'll put more on that on the website. But in terms of big events right now, we're really like laser focused on November 6th and then immediately afterwards to make sure that, voting is incredibly important and it has the opportunity to change our future. But once people have been elected, we still need to be advocating to them year round and urging them to take action. So November 6th is kind of a pause point. Like we'll take, 12 hours to process what had happened and then immediately jump back into it. Maybe more than 12 hours, but still.
Well, glad to hear that you're doing a podcast. That sits very close to our hearts over here. Caroline Weinberg, Interim Executive Director of March for Science. Again, marchforscience.com. Get involved, people. This is not some charade. It's real. And the timeline is scary. So please get involved. Go out and vote. Caroline, thank you so much for your time with us today. We look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, how a populist uprising of teachers is making a powerful mark on the midterm campaigns. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
If you're wondering where Congress's next truly bad idea will come from, keep an eye on a secretive far-right-wing outfit called ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. It's a legislative bawdy house with an exclusive corporate clientele. The Koch brothers, AT&T, ExxonMobil, and other giants pay ALEC to hook them up with Republican state lawmakers who are, on the make. In exchange for sponsoring the corporation's special interest bills, the legislators gain corporate sugar daddies to fund their future campaigns. It's a hanky-panky quid pro quo that produces litter after litter of bad laws. Consider one that's an absolute corporate wet dream, for it would remove the people's power to elect our United States senators, letting state legislators choose them. This maneuver to take power from the people and turn it over to far higher legislators would return America to the days of outright auctioning of Senate seats. Until the people passed the 17th Amendment in 1913, senators were chosen in backroom deals between corporate bribers and crooked lawmakers, and ALEC's draft proposal is bluntly succinct. The 17th Article of Amendment is hereby repealed. Back to the future. This idea of ripping off the people's democratic power is being touted by such intellectual giants as Rick Oops Perry, the corrupt ex-governor of Texas, who's now turning tricks for oil and nuclear power conglomerates as Trump's energy secretary. Perry wails that the 1913 law letting the public elect senators, quote, took the states out of the process. So now Rick and other corporate supremacists want to take the people out of the electoral process so the state can control it. The corporate state, that is. This is Jim Hightower saying, to repeal this effort, connect with commoncause.org.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Jeff Bryant has written extensively about the intersection of education and politics. He says that a movement that began with teachers' walkouts has turned into a record number of educators running for office and fighting for the future of public schools. And we say hello to Jeff Bryant, who's director of the Education Opportunity Network, an education project of People's Action. Jeff Bryant, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Our pleasure to have you with us. In a recent post, you wrote of an education wave that could inspire new candidates and votes. So what is the education wave, and how does it differ from the much-hoped-for blue wave?
The education wave is the popular uprising we're seeing coming from teachers and other educators. It started with the school walkouts that occurred earlier this year in red states like West Virginia, Kentucky, Arizona, Oklahoma, when teachers just said, we're walking out of school. We can't teach under these conditions anymore until you provide us with what we need, which was a range of things, including better salaries and health care, and especially better resources for the students, smaller class sizes, repairs to school buildings, things like that. And each of those walkouts had various success rates. Some teachers got more than what they want, not as much as what they wanted. Some were more successful than others. But what it also inspired a lot of teachers to do, because they showed such unity, is that many of them decided to run for office. They wanted to challenge these lawmakers in electoral contests. Some of the particularly Republican lawmakers were insulting to the teachers. They tried to dismiss all of their claims as being untruthful or unnecessary. And so the teachers said, well, we're going to take you on. Their slogan became, we'll remember in November. And so now we've got an unprecedented number of teachers, both current and former teachers, and also other educators, principals, administrators, what have you, who've decided to run for office. And many of them are being very successful.
And Jeff, you write about the remarkable number of educators running for office. I've seen numbers as high as 550, and that's anything from Board of Education all the way up to state Senate seats and that kind of thing. What are the driving factors, other than some of the things you mentioned, that would get them to take that step? Because it's a big step going from educator to running for office.
Yes, many of these people are running for office for the first time, and they're not connected to big money, so it's a real challenge for them. That 550 number that you tossed out is kind of a low ball, really. It's hard to get an exact count of how many educators are running for office. The 550 number comes from the National Education Association. It's 550 of their members who are running for office. I saw a number the other day reported by the Associated Press. It was coming from the Democratic Legislation Campaign Committee. That they counted 650 educators running just for state legislature. So I think it's safe to say that there are many hundreds of educators who've decided to take up the cause. And the things that they want, it's pretty hard to generalize completely about them, but it's certainly a theme that occurs in almost every one of their campaigns, is better funding for schools. It's important to remember that these candidates are not all Democrats. That's how it differs from the blue wave. According to the DLCC tally of 650, there were 480 who were running as Democrats, and the rest are running as Republicans or independents. But even the Republicans candidates are saying, we want better funding for schools. We've had too many years of austerity. It's crippling to the children. It's hard on us. It makes it very difficult to do our job, and it's time for that to end. But the other thing that is creeping into the campaigns is certainly that we want better funding and better support for public schools. Under the era of Betsy DeVos that we're now in, the U.S. Secretary of Education, where there's a lot of emphasis on so-called school choice, options other than public schools, such as charter schools or private schools that are funded by vouchers. We've seen a lot of money pulled out of public schools and sent to these other alternatives. And many of these candidates are saying that we have to take a pause and think about what we're doing there, either ending some of these programs or definitely putting them on a moratorium or giving them stricter regulations, because a lot of that money is just siphoned into private pockets instead of into classroom instruction. In other places, some educators are more incensed about the tone of local government, the Trump effect, if you will, of how authoritarian politicians have become, how dismissive they are of particularly women who work hard in the public sector, and how anti-union many of these politicians are. They want to see that change too. It's not to say that this educator wave is an anti-Trump wave. I wouldn't put it that way. As I said, some of them who are running for office are Republicans and indeed voted for Trump. But what it is, it's a populist wave, much like the what we've seen in elections in the Democratic Party, where a new form of populism is coming up from the ground up and saying, we want change and we want it driven by what the common people want and not what the policy leaders have been saying for years.
Mm-hmm. Now, thinking about specific races and regions, where do you see the potential of education as an issue and educators as candidates to make an impact on November 6th?
One election that stands out to me is the current election for governor in Arizona. We have an educator. His name is David Garcia, running on the Democratic side. He is a former associate state superintendent in the state. He's a college professor. He's taking on the incumbent Doug Ducey. Arizona is one of these states that people have been saying for years would trend blue, but yet Trump won Arizona fairly handily. But Garcia is taking a very pro-education stance in his campaign, and it's obviously working well for him. The election is a toss-up currently. At least that's the way I've seen it in the latest polls. Another election where you see education very prominent is the governor's race in Florida, where Andrew Gillum is going after his opponent DeSantis on the Republican side with a call to let's fund education better. DeSantis, as the Republican candidate, is very pro-Trump, a Tea Party type, and Gillum said it's time to end that kind of austerity. We need to. He wants to increase education funding by $1 billion. Another governor's race where education is prominent is Stacey Abrams, the Democratic candidate in Georgia. She's campaigning against a voucher program in that state that steers money away from public schools. In terms of regional action, there are so many educators who are running in Oklahoma and Kentucky and West Virginia that it'll be very interesting to see how many of them are going to be successful. The majority of them, the last count I saw was 70-something%, won their primaries or advanced without having a primary contest. So their track record is remarkably good. And it's not just in the red states where this is happening too. Well, we also have Wisconsin, which is what I'd call a purple state. It's had, though, a Republican governor for years, Scott Walker. There's an educator competing against him for governor, Tony Evers. And Evers is making a big point of better salary for teachers and also a cap on the state's voucher program, which Scott Walker expanded statewide. Last poll I saw, Evers was up. So there are many places where educators are leading and education is leading as an issue.
We're speaking with Jeff Bryant, director of the Education Opportunity Network, an education project of People's Action. Jeff, in another post you wrote, you suggest another possibility after midterms, that progressive candidates may end the funding versus accountability war. Explain to us the battle lines of that war and how it may shift.
This is a war that goes way back. For years, I would say at least 30, 40 years, Republicans have made the argument that it's useless to put more money into education because educators aren't accountable, quote unquote, accountable. And that's kind of a very vague way to describe somebody's job. What are you accountable for? What is a teacher accountable for? Well, what the Republicans decided that they were accountable for is improving test scores. And that argument caught on with the Clinton administration, Bill Clinton administration in the 90s, where he also took up that banner and said, okay, we'll fight for funding for teachers because we're the Democratic Party, but we also agree with Republicans that they need to be made more accountable. And that argument became basically the law of the land. It was it was finally enshrined into federal statutes in the George W. Bush administration under federal policy called No Child Left Behind, that required every state to test all their students in reading and math, and then there were consequences if the scores didn't improve. That policy was continued under Barack Obama. But teachers for years have been saying it's unfair because, first of all, the correlation of test scores to poverty is extremely high. And almost every time you see a school that has low test scores, you can just make a ballpark assumption about the demographics of the students. There are exceptions for sure, but it's just a statistical universality that test scores are going to be very correlative to the demographics of the students. If the kids live in poverty or they don't speak the language well, they tend not to do as well on the tests. And we've got now a majority non-white student population. About half the students live in poverty. Teachers are pointing out that their conditions are harder at home, so it makes the job of teaching tougher when the kids come to school. Also, we've had this horrible financial austerity. We've had class size increases, which makes teachers' jobs harder. And all those have an impact on test scores. And teachers have been saying, look, we can't have this trade-off anymore. It's unfair. You can't keep telling us we're not accountable for these test scores while you're robbing us of our funding and you're not doing anything to improve our situation. I think that point is starting to get across. And it's not getting across to people, and including politicians, because of some kind of new statistical report or some kind of breakthrough idea. It's getting across because what teachers have finally been able to get into the media about their work. That was what was so remarkable about the teacher walkouts this spring, is that teachers used their own voices and their own experiences to explain the conditions in schools. They didn't use statistics and test scores and things that don't really move people. They got onto social media and showed videos of what their classrooms look like and what the textbooks they have to use in school look like. That really moved people. And you can see it now in these candidates who I've just mentioned and others who are taking up that cause because they've now seen that the population is changing now. They're starting to get it, that the problems with our school systems are not the lack of accountability, they're the lack of support.
If educators do win in November, do you see them as allies on progressive issues other than education?
That's a very good question and hard to ascertain right now. Most of the educators that whose campaigns I've looked at, they're very much running on education. Now, there are exceptions. Some of them are also especially talking about healthcare issues. But But many of these candidates, they've made education their banner. But the thing that's important to realize about educators is that they tend to have a progressive mindset for a number of reasons. First of all, they believe that people can grow and change and learn and stretch their capacities. That's a progressive idea. But also, the way that our society has been going over the past 2-3 decades is that we've turned educators really into first responders to children, to their needs. Because as we've pulled away all these other programs, you think about welfare, job assistance, healthcare, all these housing, all of these programs that have been constricted due to financial austerity. What happens is all the children that experience those things, the lack of housing, the lack of adequate nutrition, the problems with opioid addiction, they bring that to school. The teachers see it firsthand. And so we've made teachers these firsthand responders. And so they're the ones that know what's going on in our communities. And that would make them very likely to be progressive allies, especially on issues of healthcare and the needs of children. Also, teachers are 78%, I think I got that figure about right, female. So teachers are going to be generally aligning with progressives on women's rights. And that's certainly going to be what I'm looking forward to seeing after the election, is having more educators as lawmakers who can bring their voices into these arguments and fortify what progressives are already saying.
Certainly, yeah. And quite frankly, long overdue. Jeff Bryant, director of the Education Opportunity Network, which is an education project of People's Action, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Jeff, we appreciate your time with us today and look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Thanks for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Marc Morial, president of the National Urban League, talks with guest host Sabrina Siddiqui on The Bill Press Show about the impact of voter suppression and the fight to stop it.
A lot of news, of course, making the rounds. Of course, we're following the reaction and the latest from the attempted attacks on both former and current Democratic officials, those who've served in the Obama administration, others who've simply picked feuds with the president. Apparently, the investigation is centered on the Miami area because that is where some of these packages were apparently processed. So that's a story we'll try to bring you updates on as we continue through the remainder of the hour. But joining us now is Marc Morial, who is the National Urban League president and CEO.
Good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm doing great and good to be with you this
morning. Good to be with you as well. There's a lot to break down. We're obviously less than 2 weeks out from the November midterms. And talk a little bit about what you're focused on.
We've been on the road. I've been to Wisconsin. I've been to Kentucky. I'll be in Louisiana and out west. In the next week, we have an active campaign called Enough is Enough Vote. We have a team that'll be in Atlanta, in Georgia, on tomorrow, working to activate voters, to get the vote out, and also to educate people about what to do if they see voting irregularities. So we've got a strong effort. This is a critical, important, essential election. It's not time for excuses. We're encouraging people to take advantage of early voting, and we want to make sure people understand. We find when we work in communities. I was in Philadelphia last week, that many people may want to vote, may not be quite aware, they may not be registered. Unfortunately, it's too late in a place like Pennsylvania. Or they're new to a neighborhood, they are registered, and they want to know where to vote. So voter education is a very important component of this, and voter protection is, because there is a rampant movement across the country to suppress the vote. It's an active campaign. It's been going on for many years. The alt-right, the far right, have been animating this effort. 30 states have sought to pass voter suppression, voter ID, cut back on early voting, all across the board, exact match requirements. We're suggesting to people, do not be deterred. Get out and vote.
So you mentioned these voter suppression tactics, because quite a few of them are making the news. Certainly Georgia is one of the more prominent examples. Stacey Abrams, who is running for governor against the sitting Secretary of State in Georgia, Brian Kemp, and there's been a purging of majority African-American voters from the rolls. Now, there's also in North Dakota controversy around Native Americans, because the Supreme Court essentially sided with or ruled that they have to have postal addresses that are more specific, which with street names, they don't typically have that. I think in Texas, there's an effort to suppress younger voters. So what are you seeing? How big of a concern is it?
The Supreme Court has been part of the voter suppression machine. Their decision in Shelby, their decision to greenlight voter purges. It's not something I would expect the Supreme Court, which should protect our individual rights and liberties, to do. So one of the things we're doing, certainly we have in the civil rights communities, lawyer allies, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the American Civil Liberties Union, all of them have armies of lawyers who, where possible and where needed, are taking legal action to try to shut down these purges and shut down these activations. So people, however, have to be vigilant, and people cannot be deterred. We're saying to people, go in. If you have to cast a provisional ballot, cast a provisional ballot. We cannot allow this voter purge effort to intimidate, frustrate, or stop people from voting. And we're going to be in a fight for many, many months and years against these voter suppression efforts until Congress passes a new Voting Rights Act, an updated Voting Rights Act, to fix the hole blown into the act by the Supreme Court in the Shelby decision in 2013.
Yes, because these are elections that could ultimately come down to just a few thousand votes, right?
Close elections. We've seen close elections before. There's the legendary Gore v. Bush. The presidential election in 2016 rode on a handful of votes cast in 3 states. People have to recognize every single vote counts. The absentee votes count. The last-minute people who stay in line up until 8 o'clock and hang in there until they can vote. We have got to encourage people to vote. What I see is an energized electorate. What I see in the African-American community is great interest in voting. And I also see in the African-American community this opportunity for some historic pickups. You've got Stacey Abrams running in Georgia. You've got Andrew Gillum running in Florida, both for governor, both
Ben Jealous as well.
Ben Jealous in Maryland. And then you've also got Mike Espy running for the United States Senate down in Mississippi, a race that's not gotten as much national attention. These would be historic victories, no doubt. And so you also have African Americans running for Congress in districts that are majority white. Antonio Delgado in New York, the woman who won the primary, can't think of her name, in Connecticut, Ayanna Pressley in Boston. You've got a new generation of candidates, and you've got certainly a new generation of African-American candidates who are demonstrating great prowess, great ability to compete, great ability to navigate, and what I want to mention, broad appeal, appealing to broad segments of voters. And that's why there's a lot of excitement out there in this election.
Some of these candidates you mentioned have been on the receiving end of attacks that are very much focused on race. Andrew Gillum just participated in a debate in the Florida governor's race with his Republican opponent, Ron DeSantis. who right after Andrew Gillum won the primary the following day, this was DeSantis who made the statement that we don't want to monkey this up. He didn't apologize. He refused to apologize. He only said that he had not, he wasn't referring to race, even though the phrase itself is obviously loaded.
It's clear he was.
You mentioned
dog whistle politics.
You mentioned Delgado, who Republicans are running ads suggesting he's dubbing him as a rapper, trying to, it seems, scare people. Can you talk a little bit just about the way that the politics of fear and race have played out?
This is nothing new. This is part and parcel. I, of course, am from New Orleans. I was elected there both to the state senate and mayor, ran multiple campaigns for others for many years, and you saw appeals to race, subtle as well as overt, were part and parcel of Southern politics for years, from the 1950s continuing through. This has now become beyond the South, if you will. But let me tell you what it is. When people do that, they're indicating desperation. When people do that, they're indicating they have no substantive issue to run on, that all they want to do is stoke the flames of fear in voters. And I think that both Andrew Gillum and Stacey Abrams have been very direct. I think it's got to be counteracted immediately. It has to be called out. And reasonable people will understand that has no place in American politics. But it's what losers do. It's what people who feel they can't appeal to voters based on any substance. They use race. They use division. They use demagoguery to try to stoke fears in the electorate, get people to vote based on that.
I want to play a clip really quickly because, this is something that happens a lot, right? Especially with Republicans. They're running for office and then they end up taking contributions and donations and support from people who are outwardly and definitively racist. And Andrew Gillum, I thought this was such a good clip from the debate that he had with Ron DeSantis earlier this week, where he says, I'm not calling him racist.
My grandmother used to say a hit dog will holler, and it hollered through this room. Mr. DeSantis has spoken. First of all, he's got neo-Nazis helping him out in this state. He has spoken at racist conferences. He's accepted a contribution and would not return it from someone who referred to the former president of the United States as a Muslim, Nigger. When asked to return that money, he said no. He's using that money to now fund negative ads. Now, I'm not calling Mr. DeSantis a racist. I'm simply saying the racists believe he's a racist.
That is an amazing line.
That's a great line. And
it's a great line.
It's accurate. He's been endorsed by racist elements. Look,
Ron DeSantis, yes.
Look, almost 30 years ago in Louisiana, David Duke, the Imperial Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, won a seat in the runoff for governor of Louisiana. He ended up only getting 42% of the vote, but carried almost a majority of the white vote in Louisiana. These strands of race, these appeals to race are nothing new. I think Andrew Gillum has done the right thing by calling it out. You've got to call it out. No more can we operate in a world where we allow hatred to be tacitly ignored. We've got to call it out, and we've got to appeal to the better instincts in people to say, we don't want that as a part of our politics. We don't want that as a part of our discourse, and we don't want people who wink and nod to hate groups in America serving in public office.
And there's obviously an authenticity, too, if the person who is responding is a person of color themselves, someone like Andrew Gillum or Stacey Abrams. Can you talk a little bit about the diversity of the field in 2018? Because there's been a record number of candidates of color, a record number of Muslims, record number of women. It certainly seems to be the case that increasingly the electorate does want officials who are more representative of the diversity in this country.
It's long overdue. It's long overdue. The idea that people who are Black, Latino, Asian, Muslim, gay, Native American can serve in public office, can do it competently, can do it in a fashion where they represent the interest of all people. I think this election may be a reckoning and may prove that point. I believe that it also serves to encourage more people to participate in politics and participate in the elections process and run for office when they see themselves, when they see others. What excites me is the number of young people running for office. I mean, I ran for office the first time I was 25 years old. I ran for Democratic delegate in 1984, pledged to Jesse Jackson. I got elected to the Louisiana Senate. I was 32. I got elected mayor. I was 35. At the beginning of my career, I met at every single turn arguments that I was too young. I was too young to compete. I was too young to serve. I beat it back every single time, which is why I've got such a passion when I see young people, intelligent young people, assertive young people that have hope and vision running for office and offering themselves to serve. And it's only a positive thing. And it reflects the future of America, which is a diverse America. It's a gumbo America. It's a mosaic. It's a tapestry. And that is what our elected officials should look like the nation.
And then you've been all across the country, and we're in the home stretch now. And what are you finding to be the issues that voters are truly prioritizing as they head to the polls?
I think that the polling and the political pundits, the public opinion polls say people are most concerned about health care, and it may run the highest. I think people are concerned about the direction of the country. I think that people are concerned about sending a message. I think people want to send a message that hate speech, if you will, coarse division, personal attacks on people, not the kind of politics they endorse. This is a larger, if you will, referendum on the future of the country. Inside of it, there's the issues of health care, there's the issues of reproductive rights, there's the issue of civil rights and the judiciary, there's the issues of income inequality that are inside of this debate, inside of this discussion. But I think it's about a bigger issue. I think it's about a gut check on what kind of country we want to have.
We were just talking about how the politics of division and stoking fears around race, around immigration, it's nothing new. It dates back, throughout the course of this country's history. But in what ways has this president really emboldened people to run these campaigns that are very much rooted in the politics of fear?
He sought to normalize it, and he sought to say it's okay because being that way is being real and it's being politically incorrect. He's normalized it. But I want to remind people that the 2000, and this is a larger conversation for maybe another day, the president did not win a majority of the popular vote. He's never polled higher than 41%, 42% in the public opinion polls. 2 out of the last 3 presidents of the United States, Donald Trump and George W. Bush, were elected without receiving a majority of the popular vote. They were elected through this quirky, outdated, antiquated electoral college system. We got to get rid of that, because what we're doing is it's a perversion to democracy when you can win an election in a democratic country and not get a majority of the vote. The reason why I say that is because I think that gerrymandering and the system, the structure of the system, is one of the reasons why we have some of the elected officials we have today.
And so, as you said, this is a president who is historically unpopular. He's also elevated a lot of the voices that were more quiet, that kept these opinions to themselves. Sometimes there's a question as to whether we're fixated on this narrative that this is going to be a referendum on the president, that these midterms will be. But are you in fact hearing that's what's motivating voters?
I think that on an overall basis, it's a motivating factor because it reflects the information that they've been a witness to for now almost 2 years. Now, inside of that, in individual races, voters are going to make, particularly in competitive races, right? They're going to make a choice between candidate A, candidate B, and the positions that they hold. But I think there's something else larger going on. This is a different kind of midterm. It feels like a different kind of midterm. I was in Philadelphia last week visiting an historic church and talking to them about getting out the vote, and they shared with me that they had their own phone bank that they had organized, completely on their own. It's not tied to any candidate. It's not tied to any party. It's not tied to any organization. Reason why I illustrate that is that you see that in this cycle, you have a lot of people doing things independent, on their own, because of their concern about the direction of the country. They're not waiting for a political party, a political candidate, an organization to say, come on, come participate, let's get out the vote. And I've not witnessed that in a midterm. I've seen it in presidential cycles, but not in a midterm.
So you feel like there is this unusual enthusiasm. Are there any particular areas that you're more focused on? Where are a lot of your efforts dedicated?
So there's a lot of energy in places like Georgia and places like Florida and places like Texas, where they're high-profile, highly competitive races. Since we're using social media, we're touching people all over the country, but we have focused efforts in a number of places. So, for example, this weekend, the Urban League team, the team of the National Urban League and the Atlanta Urban League will be in Georgia, will be participating in. There's a big homecoming for Morehouse College. And so there are going to be tens of thousands of young people, and we'll be reminding them to vote. We will be sharing with them our hotline, places to report voter irregularities as a part of voter protection campaign. So we have efforts underway in a number of places, but we're not out there alone. I mean, there are many civil rights, professional associations. But what I want to remind people is this election is a horse race, and now it's coming into the home stretch. And I think the horses are neck and neck. So this can't be, I saw the poll and the election's over, so I don't need to vote. This has got to be every vote until the bell sounds, has to be counted, has to be in. We don't want people asleep. We don't want them to rest. We want them to work. We want them to vote. We want them to make sure the people in their homes vote, people in their social networks vote. I've been challenging people to send out at least one social media message a day to their network to remind them to get out and vote.
That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Carolyn Weinberg, Jeff Bryant, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter. And leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.